Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community, is brought to you by Husqvarna Viking, keeping the world sewing for over 140 years. Hi, and welcome to Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community. I'm Mary Kate Karr-Petras, and I'm here with our friend Karen Charles, who's an event specialist with Husqvarna Viking. Welcome, Karen.
Hi. Great to be back.
We're happy to have you. You've got some great tips for us, and today we're going to be talking about creative ways to bind our quilts, right?
Yep.
So tell us what we have.
So one of the first things we're going to start with is piping.
Okay.
A lot of quilters are not used to thinking about using other sewing techniques in their quilts because they started as quilters and they never maybe have worked with piping before, and a lot of the other different things that we're going to be doing today. So I thought I would just give a little bit of tips on how to use piping, how to introduce it into your quilt. The first thing that you've got to consider is what size of piping that you're going to use and what it's made out of. Something very fine like this works extremely well in a quilt, and even to this size. But once you start getting into the larger quilts, your quilt is going to kind of not lay flat if you use it, unless you use it very carefully. So because piping is made out of different fibers, some are nylon, some are cotton, polyester, it's really important to put an iron on top of it with some steam, good hot steam, and see if it shrinks. A lot of times, if the piping's been made out of nylon or polyester, you'll see that it'll shrink in maybe from 10 inches to 8 inches or even less.
Wow.
So that you can imagine how that would affect your quilt.
That's substantial.
It is substantial. So the first thing that I always warn anybody once you start getting into playing with different types of piping is check and see if it's going to shrink on you.
Now,
do it before you put it into the quilt.
When you say you get the iron on it, do you literally put the pressing surface on to
I don't touch the iron to it, but I lay it so it's very close because it could melt depending. If it's nylon, it might melt.
Sure.
So you want to put it just so that it's really close and give it some the hottest steam you've got and see. If you start to see it move in, you know that you've got an issue. Make sure you treat the whole row of piping before you start sewing it into your quilt.
Okay, great.
So for most quilts, this size is really nice. This would be a mini size piping, and this would be a regular size piping. I like to make my own piping because then you can make it out of whatever fabric you want. If you buy the pre-made stuff, you're pretty much stuck with a solid color, and the quality of the fabric's not necessarily up to what you'd want to put into a quilt. So when I'm making my own piping, this is a square of fabric. I usually buy 1.25 yards because it ends up being a square 44 inches. And then I can get enough binding or piping that would, do a couple of quilts. On the cross grain, we don't have a lot of the straight of the grain and the cross grain, we don't have a lot of stretch. But on the bias, you can see how much stretch we have. So it is something that you're going to want to cut your piping fabric on the bias, just like you would for binding.
45-degree angle across the fabric.
It makes it a lot stronger, but more importantly, it gives us that stretch we need to go around corners or to really make it be exactly the shape that we want it to be. So we're going to put that aside. I've already got a piece cut, and we're going to talk about feet. If you have a sewing machine in your quilter, there's a decent chance that you're used to using a straight stitch and nothing else. So sometimes it's a little bit different to think about how you want to adjust your machine. This is a zipper foot, and this would be a traditional foot to use if you didn't have a piping foot. But life gets a lot easier when you have a piping foot. The way that you would work with this is, can you pass me the piping, please?
This one?
That'll work too. So the way you would sew, this is a pre-made piping. It's like an upholstery piping. You can see that it's got this beautiful decorative cord. You would use the zipper foot by putting it right up against it and then have the needle sew right close to the edge. Any of the piping feet, if you look at the difference between them, the bottoms are dug out. And the way that you use it, the piping or the raised area gets underneath the foot. So now, side to side, that piping's not going to move. So we're going to set up on our machine, and we're going to use the mini piping foot. It's clear so that you've got a really good visibility of what you're doing. And wait a second there. And we're just going to take our piping, and it doesn't matter the size. This is much larger than it needs to be. I usually cut it about an inch and a quarter to an inch. But the size is totally irrelevant, and you're going to see why in a few minutes. So basically, I'm coming in, and I'm going to tuck the piping inside and putting it over in my machine. I'm first going to just make sure that the piping is underneath that groove.
So it just fits right in there.
Right underneath there.
Nice.
Now, if I was to sew right now, the needle is going to be right up tight next to the cord, which is fine for the final step, but we're not at that final step.
Okay.
So what we're going to do is we're going to move our needle to the right. And it can be 2 or 3 notches to the right. We have 29 needle positions here, so you can imagine there's a lot of room to move it left or right.
Yeah.
I want that final stitching to be where the center needle position is. So right now, all we're trying to do is couch it in. And I can take my stylus and come down like that. If you find that that's a little bit easier, a lot of people like to do that. They kind of create a little groove. And all I'm going to do is start sewing. And
Maybe watch your right hand.
what's that? Okay.
Just watch your right hand. Sometimes
Okay.
it's
Okay, so all we're going to do is just let the piping, the cord is going underneath that groove, and it is sewing the piping into place. That easy. And I'll take it out, and then you can see what's happening here. So you can see the cords there. We're not
Just lie it
anywhere.
down here.
We're not anywhere close to it. You can see there's still a lot of room.
Right.
But the first set of stitching is just to hold it in place. Then we're going to move the needle back toward the center, and it'll come a little closer. So as we go, we're going to take our quilt over here. If we were attaching our piping to the edge, this would not be a very good edge to it because it's going to roll over to we're going to use a traditional binding with it, and we've put it together and sewn the piping on it. You can notice how narrow this is. It's very important that the seam allowance is 1/4 of an inch. You can see how much I've got here. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull over our piping hop binding tool, and this is what it looks like. There's a lot of other different types of ones around, but what's important when you look at it is that there's 1/4 of an inch. This side, there's 1/4 of an inch, and then you see the groove that the piping is going to sit in. And where'd that piping go that I had?
This one right here?
Yeah, the one that was made. So what we can do is we put our seam allowance like this, put the tool on top of it, and then we cut it off so that we only have a perfect 1/4 of an inch seam
Okay.
allowance. With our rotary cutter, and we can bring it over here so you can see. And what I usually will like to do, and that's not going to work. I'll cut it like that so you can see. So now we've cut it, we've got a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and what I'll do is when I've sewn it, I'll just keep pulling it through like that, and then you end up having that perfect 1/4 of an
No
inch.
guesswork involved.
No, and it's really important if you're going to put it inside a quilt, like I have a quilt that I brought where the piping's inset in the center. It has to have a 1/4 inch seam allowance because it has to fit into the piecing of the quilt. And you'll see the sample that I have there. This is another one where it was put inside. For this is kind of an artsy little quilt that I'm working on. It's not important that it have a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but you can see how fine it is.
Right.
This is the size that we're working with, and it gives you an idea of how you can kind of incorporate them into the middle part of your quilt too. So now that we've got our piping, you know how to do it. I've sewn this onto my traditional binding. The raw edges are right here. The way that I'm going to put it onto my quilt is to have the raw edges lined up like this. This is the top side of my quilt.
Okay.
So, and the back is the green side. And this is the final step that I'm going to do it. I'm going to line up the raw edges with the edge of my fabric there. I'm going to put my foot down so the cord is underneath that groove. And then I just sew like I would be normally sewing binding onto it. This is not going to work very well right now because you'll notice what will happen is if I move this to the back, it's going to disappear.
Right.
So it's got to be the other way. How are you going to find out where that line is? So you see the line, the stitching line, that's the stitching line of the piping that it was attached. When we put this underneath, we shouldn't be seeing the piping. And the groove is automatically going to find the cording, so you don't need to worry about that. What we're going to do is move the needle back to the center, and this is the final resting place, right back at the center. And now I'm going to stitch that, and it's going to stitch the piping on and come right down. And I'll show you how to turn a corner because this is a little bit different. Now you can see here when I pull this back, isn't that
Perfect.
beautiful? And then this is going to get wrapped around there, and you've got a beautiful binding. When you come to the corner like this, you will find that you're going to sew it off the same way. If you turn the corner, you line up your edge of your foot with the edge of the fabric, then you know that you've stopped at the right place. And this is true of any binding.
So before you take it out of the machine?
Before I
you
take
just
it out of
turn
the machine. If you stop and you line up your foot with the edge of there, you know your seam allowance is exactly the same on this side as it is on this side.
Okay.
So then I'm just going to turn and sew off. And I just came to the corner. And now I'm going to do it just in the same way that I would normally do. Line up this edge, and you'll see it'll work better if I do it like that. See it better. Have it be straight on. You can see the miter that's happening. It's all perfectly formed. And then I'm going to come down like this. And none of that is any different from a regular binding. And then you're just going to come, and you're going to put the foot back on and start sewing again. And
Does
kind
it
of keep
feel
going.
significantly bulkier
It's
in that corner?
not significantly bulkier because the piping is underneath the foot.
Okay.
You do have to make sure you get it going of what to do. Okay, there we are. And now you can see what it looks like. So when we turn it, this is the way it's going to be if you do it like that. Okay? You see that? We want that to be tucked underneath. We don't want to see it. So that piping is going to get tucked in there so that it doesn't show.
So it takes a little maneuvering.
It does.
Okay.
And so that has to do with the way you're doing this. Now that can be opened up if you want to. It really is a little bit different, but you can see this is not a raw edge here. What we can do is turn it over, and it comes here like this, and then you would hand stitch it down. If you were going to do it differently, if you were going to make the piping first and sew it to the back side, like a lot of the quilts, I'll sew my binding to the back side and bring it forward. Then what I'm going to do is I will have my piping put on first, like this. I have my binding going to the other side and wrap it forward, and then it gets stitched right in the ditch here.
So you would have basted the piping to the front,
Right.
basically?
Sew it to the front
Okay.
first, and then your binding just comes on, wraps to the front,
it.
and stitches right there.
Got
So
it.
that's another way to do it. The
Excellent.
when you start playing with piping, it's all a little different. It's all about experimenting. But let's look at some of the other things that we were doing.
Okay, so we'll be right back and take a look at some other ways to finish your quilt.
So I wanted to show you a really creative stitch that really gives you a unique look to the edge of your binding. You see the scallop that forms here? Over on this little quilt, you'll see the sample that's got yellow thread. And it's created simply. It's doing a blanket stitch like you would use for applique, and it's just changing the way that you stitch it that gives you the different look. So over on the screen, I have a stitch, and I'm going to just sew it a little bit and show you how it starts out. And it's very close together. And what I'm going to do is, on the screen, I'm going to make the stitch longer, and I'm going to make it as wide as I can make it. We have 29 needle positions. At this point, I'm going to move it up so that it's 7 millimeters wide. Whatever you have on your machine, just make it as long as possible.
Okay.
And then you can separate it out as much as you want, and you'll see the difference. It's dramatic what it does to the fabric.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yep, I definitely see it.
Now when I cut it and take it out, you'll see. So you can see how the scalloped, in the beginning, it was a very narrow stitch.
Yes.
And as I made it a little bit farther apart, you could see how the scallop was starting to form. By making the stitch even wider, the scallop has more of a chance to develop. And that's as simple as it is. The fold, the stitch is done on the fold, so then you have the raw edges on the edge. And then from there on in, it's just doing your binding as normal.
I see, and then you just stitch it down.
This one here is stitched down close to the edge,
see.
right over the stitching that was there. If you look at it like this, you'll see it. It kind of, the stitching was added on right here, so the scallop has a little bit of a chance to raise up, gives you a nice look. On this one, I had it be a little bit narrower, and so I stitched it on the back, flipped it forward, and used a piece of fusible to
I
stick
see.
it down, so I didn't even stitch that one down,
I
it's just
see.
sitting there.
I see.
But it gives it just a completely different look that you wouldn't normally expect on a binding, and it really adds a lot to a quilt.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community, is brought to you by Husqvarna Viking, keeping the world sewing for over 140 years.